Welcome to a new video of a historical journey. Today, we present to you the history of house construction and the cultures involved in each one, Chapter 2. Today, we present the second chapter of the history of house construction and the cultures involved in each one. We will explore the history of home constructions and their cultural forms involved, from ancient Greece, 12th century BC, to the end of the Renaissance, 16th century. In ancient Greece, approximately 2,500 years ago, architectural development reflected the evolution of society and the importance attributed to both domestic life and spirituality. The construction of houses and temples during this period offered a unique insight into the interconnection between daily life and religious beliefs. Houses, especially in urban areas and among the affluent classes, were primarily built with stone. This material provided durability and long-term resistance. Greek houses often featured a design centered around an inner courtyard called the atrium, or peristyle. This courtyard served as a social center and allowed light and air to enter the dwelling. Greek houses incorporated distinctive architectural elements such as columns, friezes, and cornices. Although on a more modest scale than in temples, these elements added elegance and character to residential structures. The decoration of houses included painted frescoes on the walls, mosaics on the floor, and sculptural details. These elements often depicted mythological scenes, emphasizing the cultural and spiritual connection of the inhabitants. Additionally, these houses typically had various rooms designated for different functions, including living areas, bedrooms, and kitchens. Spatial organization focused on comfort and functionality. Greek temples, primarily dedicated to gods, were constructed with more refined materials, especially marble. This choice of material was not only aesthetic, but also symbolized the importance and durability associated with spirituality. The columns, usually arranged in a double row around the temple, created an impressive monumental entrance. These temples followed a specific architectural order, highlighting three main styles: Doric, Ionic, and Corinthian. Each of these styles had distinctive columns and ornamental details. Inside the temples, statues or altars dedicated to the worshipped deity were found. These sacred spaces were considered the dwelling place of the gods and were carefully maintained by priests and priestesses. Marble temples were adorned with sculptures and reliefs representing myths and significant episodes from Greek mythology. These sculptures also served an educational and cultural purpose. In ancient Greece, architecture not only served practical functions, but also expressed the beliefs, aesthetics, and cultural identity of society. Stone houses and marble temples were tangible evidence of the sophistication and spiritual richness of the ancient Greeks. In ancient Rome, approximately 2,000 years ago, architecture underwent a significant transformation characterized by the development of distinctive architectural elements such as arches and domes. This period, known as the Roman era, witnessed the creation of monumental structures and luxurious villas that reflected the splendor and advanced engineering of Roman civilization. The Romans were masters in the use of arches and vaults. Arches were employed in the construction of bridges, aqueducts, and especially in the architecture of amphitheaters, such as the Colosseum. Vaults were curved structures that allowed for the covering of large spaces and were crucial in the creation of buildings like thermal baths and cisterns. The Romans erected majestic amphitheaters, such as the Colosseum, where public events like gladiator battles and theatrical performances took place. Forums, public squares surrounded by buildings, became centers of civic and commercial activity. Arches were also implemented in the construction of aqueducts, elevated structures that transported water from distant sources to cities. Roman hydraulic engineering enabled the efficient supply of water to the growing population. Roman villas, especially those of the wealthier classes, were adorned with intricate and colorful mosaic floors. These mosaics depicted mythological scenes, geometric motifs, and portraits, adding an artistic and luxurious touch to the interiors. The walls of villas were often decorated with frescoes, mural paintings depicting landscapes, everyday scenes, and often mythology. These paintings contributed to the visual aesthetics of interior spaces. Roman villas often included atriums and peristyles, interior courtyards surrounded by columns, which served as social spaces and recreational areas. These architectural elements provided light and ventilation while creating elegant environments. Many villas had luxurious private baths called balnea. These baths included cold and hot pools, saunas, and relaxation areas, illustrating the importance of hygiene and well-being in Roman life. Villas were often surrounded by gardens and landscaped attractions, including ponds, fountains, and porticos. These outdoor spaces provided areas for recreation and leisure. Roman architecture, with its arches, vaults, and elaborate villas, was not only a technical achievement, but also an expression of the wealth and culture of Roman civilization. The emphasis on decoration, design, and advanced engineering left an architectural legacy that influenced later styles and continues to be admired today. During the Middle Ages, spanning from the 5th to the 15th centuries, architecture and home construction were heavily influenced by the social, economic, and political conditions of the time. Medieval houses were mostly modest and functional, while fortresses and castles stood out as prominent defensive structures. Medieval houses were primarily constructed using local and readily available materials, such as wood and adobe. Wood provided an abundant resource and was used in the main structure, while adobe, a mixture of clay and straw, was employed for the walls. The design of medieval houses was functional, reflecting the everyday needs of the people. They typically consisted of a wooden structure with a pitched roof, facilitating rainwater drainage. Medieval houses tended to be compact and smaller in size compared to modern constructions. The roofs of medieval houses were covered with thatch or tiles, providing insulation and protection against the elements. This type of roofing was characteristic of rural architecture. Medieval houses often had small and sparse windows, as openings in the walls were considered weak points in terms of security and thermal insulation. Castles and fortresses were more elaborate and robust constructions, usually made of stone and brick instead of wood. This provided greater resistance against attacks and adverse weather conditions. Fortresses and castles featured strategically positioned watchtowers to observe the surrounding environment and detect potential threats. Defensive walls and moats often surrounded castles, offering an additional barrier against invasions. Moats were designed to hinder the access of potential invaders. The keep, a main structure within the castle, served as the residence of the feudal lord and also as a last refuge in case of a siege. Medieval military architecture incorporated elements such as battlements and arrow slits to allow defenders to shoot arrows and throw objects at attackers without exposing themselves fully. Castles were not only defensive strongholds, but also administrative centers and residences. They included banquet halls, chapels, and other facilities necessary for daily life. Medieval architecture reflected the circumstances of the time, where security and functionality were prioritized. While medieval houses were modest and constructed with local materials, fortresses and castles stood out as defensive structures, symbolizing power and authority. During the Renaissance, spanning from the 14th to the 17th centuries, a cultural and artistic rebirth occurred in Europe that significantly influenced architecture. The rediscovered admiration for classical architectural principles from ancient Greek and Roman times had a profound impact on residential constructions and the way people lived during this period. In the Renaissance, classical Greek and Roman columns, such as Doric, Ionic, and Corinthian, were adopted and adapted. These columns became fundamental elements in the architecture of Renaissance homes, adding an elegant and symmetrical aesthetic. Arches and vaults were used more frequently and with greater sophistication in the construction of Renaissance residences. These architectural elements not only served an aesthetic function, but also provided structural stability and allowed for more spacious and luminous designs. There was an emphasis on a return to classical proportions and symmetry. The application of geometric and mathematical principles in architecture sought to create visual harmony and balance in structures. Renaissance homes adopted an architectural style that incorporated classical principles. Symmetrical facades, pediments, porticos, and ornamental details were common features in houses of this period. In contrast to the small and sparse windows of the Middle Ages, Renaissance homes featured larger and more decorative windows. This allowed for increased natural light and created brighter interiors. Similar to ancient Rome, interior courtyards and loggias were reintroduced. These spaces provided ventilation and natural light, serving as social and recreational areas. More elaborate decorative elements, such as sculptures, friezes, and reliefs, were introduced in the architecture of Renaissance homes. The ornamentation reflected an interest in artistic expression and aesthetic beauty. Renaissance homes were not only places of residence, but also visual expressions of the status and wealth of their owners. Architecture became a means to highlight social standing. Renaissance residences often included spaces dedicated to art and culture, such as art galleries, libraries, and music halls. This reflected the importance attributed to education and the arts during this period. Renaissance architecture also influenced urban planning. Renaissance cities were designed with public squares, wide streets, and orderly buildings, fostering community life and social interaction. The Renaissance not only transformed architecture, but also affected how people lived and experienced the built environment. Attention to classical principles, aesthetic beauty, and cultural expression left a lasting mark on the history of architecture and everyday life. And that's all for today. If you enjoyed the video, don't forget to subscribe to add a dose of history to your life, give it a like, and activate the notification bell to stay informed about new videos. And if you want to support the channel, you can do so through Patreon. Thank you for joining us on this new historical journey.